Welcome to this presentation of Maurice Ducosté and the invention of lobotomy. Even though trepinations had been performed for psychiatric disorders before, procedures exposing the brain itself became feasible only with the birth of modern neurosurgery in the end of the 19th century. An early neuropsychiatric procedure was trephination with opening of the dura and CSF drainage introduced in 1889. This was mainly performed for general paralysis of the insane in neurosyphilis. Neurosyphilis with dementia paralytica, more commonly known as general paresis of the insane, was a severe health problem in the early 20th century. These patients occupied 10% of the beds in the psychiatric wards, and 80% would, after admission, soon suffer an often horrendous death. It was known as the Great Imitator because the difficulty of differentiating it from other psychiatric disorders. While we today consider this infectious disease to be in the realm of the microbiologists, neurosyphilis was in the pre-antibiotic era perceived as a mental disorder of central importance in the field of psychiatry, a field which in many cases was the responsibility of the neurologist. The first effective treatment was introduced by the Nobel Prize winner Julius Wagner von Jauregg. He discovered that by inoculating the patients with malaria-infested blood, a high rate of remissions could be achieved, and the fatality rate decreased around 5 to 10%. This soon became the standard treatment and remained so until the introduction of penicillin in the mid-40s, but was in continuous use until the 70s. Regarding surgical procedures, the first intracerebral procedures were done by the Swiss psychiatrist Dr. Gottlieb Burkhardt. He operated 6 schizophrenic patients with removal of various cortical areas chosen quite randomly and with very limited success. In 1910 in St. Petersburg, the neurosurgeon Ludwig Pusep, in collaboration with the neurologist Vladimir Besterev, performed the first frontal procedures, cutting of paretofrontal connections in 3 patients with poor results. However, this was not reported until 1937 and had no importance for the future of lobotomy. Thus, according to the traditional accounts, nothing happened in the field of psychosurgery during the period between 1891 until the introduction of the leucotomy by Moniz in 1936. Egas Moniz was beyond doubt a very gifted man, not least concerning his social and diplomatic skills. These were not only displayed within the field of science, but also in the world of politics, where he served as both ambassador and minister for external affairs in Portugal, before focusing on his career in neurology. He created a name for himself with his pioneering work in cerebral angiography. He was here actively pursuing the Nobel Prize, relying not solely on his scientific skills, but largely on social networking and promotional activities. Many of his actions displayed an obsession with priority, and it has been said that he would go to extremes to avoid sharing any of the credit. In the end, he fell on the finishing line. This was a grave personal loss for him, and he would therefore pursue the Nobel Prize for his leucotomy with even greater zeal. His patients suffered mainly from psychiatric disorders. His views on such conditions were of an organic nature, and he considered the current treatments to be unsatisfactory, with, as he wrote, the exception of malarial treatment in general paralysis. It is therefore not surprising that he would now investigate treatments of a more organic nature. It has been difficult to reconstruct the path leading Moniz to the frontal leucotomy, especially since he himself was very reluctant to acknowledge any influence, except from some studies on frontal lobe functions and frontal lobectomies in tumor patients. His theory on fixed ideas can hardly have been the foundation for his decision to perform these lesions in the frontal lobes. Further, no tests were performed in animals, and the technical preparations were allegedly limited to sticking a pencil into a brain until a satisfactory approach was found. According to the traditional narrative, Moniz was inspired by the presentation of Carlisle Jacobson on prefrontal lesions in chimpanzees in London in 1935. A few months later, he performed the first operations with the help of a young neurosurgeon, Almeida Lima, and in 1936 he presented his findings in the first 20 patients, which would render him the Nobel Prize in 1949. The first leucotomies were made with one single injection of alcohol into each frontal lobe through a single burr hole on each side. Only later did he increase the number of injections before introducing the core method with mechanical lesions using a leucotomy and even later multiple burr holes on each side. This story was, however, not endorsed by Moniz himself, who reported that he had informed Almeida Lima of his idea already 2.5 years before he heard the presentation of Jacobson in London, and this places us in Paris in 1932. At a meeting of the French Academy of Medicine in 1932, Moniz presented a paper on angiography, and immediately after him, Maurice Ducosté presented his cerebral impalludations, and these papers also appeared together in published form. Here, Moniz would have learned that more than 100 patients with general paresis and a very large number of patients with other psychiatric conditions, including schizophrenia and mania, had been operated with favorable results using injections into the frontal lobes. Further, that this had been done without any serious complications. This is the missing link explaining how Moniz could embark on the path to leucotomy on such loose grounds. Ducosté was a psychiatrist working at the Asylum of Villejuif in Paris. He started with animal experiments before human tests. In 1920, he performed mechanical lesions with a steel wire in the frontal lobes in schizophrenics, later also in mania and depressions. In 1925, he introduced injections, and in 1927, injections with blood and for general paresis. In 1933, the total number of patients was reported as 268, about half probably with general paresis. In 1940, 1,000 patients, of which 405 for schizophrenia and other non-GP conditions, were reported. The operations were normally done in local anesthesia. A trephination was performed at a point 10 cm behind the orbital arcade and 2 to 4 cm lateral of the midline. A needle was inserted 4 to 4.5 cm into the frontal lobe using a special device. As far as I can understand, the tip of the needle would end up in the same area as was later targeted by Moniz. Up to 5 cubic centimeters of blood and other substances were then injected into one or both frontal lobes, and this could be repeated up to 12 times in staged procedures, which must have created significant lesions in this area. In total, the group of Ducosté presented 16 papers and monographs between 1932 and 1940. Regarding outcome, details were only presented for general paralysis with a success rate of 81%, while the results were said to be more modest in other indications. However, Ducosté might perhaps be suspected of not being completely impartial when he wrote that This method has resulted in the cure of 250 paralytics, who not only resume their normal life, but who have become superior to what they have ever been. It seems that the injections into the brain stimulates the intellectual faculties, modifies the character, provides youth and strength. Many of these cured paralytics occupy positions which one would not have dared to confide them before their illness. Many have become athletes, filled with energy and activity. A certain number among them, impotent since years, have procreated children of excellent shape. Cerebral impaludation was mainly the work of Ducosté himself, but the procedure was also performed by others in France. It is claimed that it was used in many psychiatric hospitals in Germany and also in Japan since 1933, as well as in other countries, and a number of papers were published in Italy and Argentina. Later, after Moniz, others would also try injections of blood. Walter Freeman became aware of Ducosté during a later time and tried blood injections using the transorbital approach. In 1936, Moniz presented the leucotomy in 20 patients and published his papers in 6 different languages, which he sent around the world, in order to establish priority. He used the same entry point, target, depth, injection technique and indications except GP as Ducosté, who had now presented more than 500 patients in 5 publications. The only difference was that Moniz used injections of alcohol and injected both frontal lobes in the same session. Thus it seems clear that Ducosté invented the lobotomy, and the battle of priority was started in the last paper from the group of Ducosté, where they wrote that the method of E. Moniz is thus related to the method of the Ducosté, of which it constitutes a variant, however interesting and original. This was published in May 1940, 1 week before the German invasion of France. After this, we hear no more of Impaludations, and the battle of priority died in its infancy. So, why was Ducosté forgotten? Well, the Second World War ended the work of Ducosté, and after the war, the development of the lobotomy occurred mainly in USA, where no one knew of Ducosté. Of his 15 publications, 13 were in French, and publications from other groups performing cerebral impaludations were only in Spanish and Italian. Moniz had flooded the scientific world with a high number of publications in many different languages and performed what can be described as a PR campaign to establish priority. And the worldwide interest and the rise of the lobotomy was initiated by the publications of Moniz. And Moniz never acknowledged the work of Ducosté with a single word and received the Nobel Prize in 1949. And with that I end this presentation. For further details, please consult this paper, which is available for free online on the link above. Thank you for your attention.